Today, we're gonna cover 4 different production techniques that Ninth Wonder uses in his beats.
Waiting to stake a claim on it, put their name down just to spit some game on it. With trends, I'm trying to set the mode, you know. Go at you hard like most records that sold. Spitting propaganda at you till you break down.
When it comes to Ninth Wonder's beat making techniques, a big focal point is gonna be related to what you're gonna be doing with your sample. I remember I used to watch Ninth Wonder's live stream something like 10 years ago, and one of the biggest things I took away from him was how he explained his sampling philosophy. And I think this can help a lot of producers. When thinking about Ninth Wonder, most people may recognize him for his use of vocal samples and that soulful instrumentation. And so when they find a sample, they start chopping on the vocals and then find it difficult to piece something together that sounds cohesive. When Ninth Wonder would sample in his streams, the biggest takeaway for me was that he would say he doesn't actually listen for the things that you might think that he does. He doesn't start by making his chops around vocals, rather he actually listens to the underlying music. And from there, once he has that established, at that point, he thinks about all of the other pieces like the vocals and whatnot. Now this all might sound a bit confusing, but let me explain this with an actual example that I have here. And by the way, before we get into it, if you guys like my content, please think about subscribing. It really does help me out, and it's really easy to unsubscribe if you ever get tired of my videos. Alright, so here is the beat that I made in that Ninth Wonder aesthetic. So you can hear this beat sounds cohesive and it makes sense musically. It also has those nice vocal samples going throughout it like a Ninth Wonder beat would. But initially when I created this loop, I didn't care about that at all. I listened for and found chops that made sense musically. What you can do in order to help with this is to listen for the underlying notes in the lower end, whether it's the bass notes or the chords. If I were to cut all the high-end frequencies and solo the sample so you guys can hear what I'm talking about. This loop that I pieced together here makes sense musically. I also tried making another beat somewhat in the similar style. This beat didn't capture that Ninth Wonder aesthetic as well as the other beat did, so it's still somewhat incomplete. But you can hear with this beat if I were to play it. Again, you might listen to that synth on top or the smaller vocals coming in and out of the beat, and when you try to sample yourself, those are the sounds that you look for and chop around when starting a beat. But again, let's cut the higher frequencies and hear what's happening at a more fundamental level. For the most part, fundamentally, we have a very basic, simple 2-part progression. We have this section right here. And then after that, we have this section. These chops here and here are somewhat transitionary, but overall, these parts right here of the sample, these are what's providing the framework for this beat. And this is what you can start thinking about when chopping. Start by finding the pieces that make sense together, musically speaking. Going back to that first example, to build this, I scoured through different parts throughout the sample and I found this chop here. This is where I started. I listened to those lower notes like I mentioned before. Then I found other parts of the sample that made sense with this initial chop. So you can hear the underlying bass notes all made sense musically speaking when played one after another. Going through some of these other chops, you can hear these chops here. These all have the same underlying bass note. Even though the melodic notes and instrumentation are different between these different chops, that wasn't as important to me initially. What was more important was the fundamental note that was playing underneath. Again, you can hear it. It's the exact same note over and over again. And so that's how we have these similar pieces here that we can use somewhat interchangeably when creating a loop. Which leads me to my next point, which is how to add those vocals within your beat in the best possible way. So we've established that the underlying music is what's important. Once you search through your sample and find different chops that make sense when played together, after you find your pieces, this is when you can start to think about what's happening with the other sounds and instruments and bringing those sounds into your beat in a balanced way. So again, for example, you can hear with these two vocal chops. These vocal chops worked when I layered them in the actual loop right here. And again, why did they work so well? You can think back to the first point that I made. All three of these chops have the exact same lower note, which is why adding these chops on top of this one worked as well as it did right here. Now you may want to do some additional filtering and EQing to clean up your chops when layering like this, but nonetheless, when it comes time to adding these little textures that go in and out, think about what's currently being played underneath and find other parts of the sample that have that exact same thing playing. At that point, when you layer these pieces on top of each other, they work perfectly and you'll end up with a beat that just doesn't sound as disjointed otherwise. And by the way, if you're interested in learning how to sample and want to know the best way to do so in FL Studio, I'd recommend checking the video that's right above my head. Moving on, something else that I noticed with Ninth Wonder is his approach to his drum work. I would say that Ninth Wonder's approach to drums is very utilitarian. I wouldn't go as far as saying that drums are the focal point of his beats. You don't really hear him get as audacious with his drum patterns like you would with Dilla, for example, which is another producer who I covered in an older video right above my head. But what's interesting with Ninth Wonder, if you watch his Rhythm Roulette, you can see this, is that often he lays down his drums before piecing together his sample. This might seem insignificant and like it doesn't really matter that much, but this can really help you put your sample together in certain situations. A lot of times, especially with how detailed the sample work can be in these types of beats, producers might get hung up on trying to get their sample chops to sound perfectly seamless. If I were to play the sample without the drums, you can hear. It doesn't sound perfect, there is a bit of jagginess to it, but something that you'll eventually learn with sampling is that drums can be a great way to mask all these little imperfections and create a nice cohesion between your chops. This can help you focus on what we talked about before, creating a cool loop using all the different pieces that you found, instead of obsessing over the imperfections that you can hear with your chops once you piece them together, which in the end don't really matter once you lay your drums on top anyways. And another very useful benefit to this type of straightforward drum work is that it'll provide a very open, straightforward rhythm. If you were to get audacious with your sample and use that as a means to create something complex and dense like many of Ninth Wonder's beats do, creating something a bit more rhythmically basic with your drums will help you achieve this in a more balanced way. As opposed to getting extremely complex and detailed with your drum work and creating a very intricate rhythm, at that point, trying to fit your sample in and getting it to work well with your complex drum pattern might become much harder. Speaking of tying things together, a little bonus side tip. This isn't necessarily something that I've seen Ninth Wonder do per se, but at times what I like to do with my sample is go ahead and play around with the attack as well as the release of some of my chops. Like I showed here, I took different pieces from different parts of the sample that have vastly different instrumentation playing at times to create this loop. So what I find helps to sew these different pieces all together is increasing both the attack and the release of my chops. That way the sounds flow into each other more as opposed to having abrupt start and end times. If I try to use a chop where it cuts partway through an instrument playing, it can sound really abrupt in my beat, but doing this with the attack and sort of bring it slightly up, this just helps it sound a bit more fluid. It's just a small little detail that you can think about. Again, this is not a Ninth Wonder tip. This is something that I more so do here. And finally, the last tip, I don't think it's any surprise that Ninth Wonder gets a lot of his samples from soul and jazz records. But something that you might not pick up on is the fact that he uses an actual turntable to sample. This is significant because he will use a fader at times to repitch the sample. And when using a fader, you won't always jump up and down in complete semitones. So what can help you achieve this aesthetic is not to be perfectly on pitch when you repitch a sample. For example, you can see here with this beat, I did detune the sample to be slightly off key right here, plus 7 cents. But at this point, we're starting to cover things that I've already actually covered in older videos. This is something that I went into in more detail on my video on making boom bap. So if you're interested in seeing some more tips when it comes to making more general boom bap, I recommend checking that video out. It should be showing up on your screen right now. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If so, like and subscribe. Head over to betterbeatmaker.com if you want to check out my online beatmaking course. My free drum kit's available in the description box below, as well as a link to the Discord if you want to join my producer community. And I'll see you guys next time.